I had always known that I wasn't truly a Sullivan. They never let me forget it. From the way my parents, no, the Sullivans, looked at me to the way Sarah, their precious real daughter, spoke to me with thinly veiled contempt. I was a tool, a mere placeholder, and now I was being handed over like a bargaining chip. Hey you. Welcome to Cupid Oops, where love and logic are officially divorced and chaos has full custody. Like and subscribe. Chaos begins. Emma, you will marry Nathan Reed. My adoptive mother, Margaret Sullivan, said firmly, her cold eyes locking onto mine. I felt my breath hitch. Who? My father, George Sullivan, sighed impatiently. A man from a humble background. It's already been arranged. Sarah sat beside them, her lips curled into a smug smile. Unlike me, she was the cherished daughter, pampered and adored. She was the one set to marry Ethan Parker, the heir to one of the most powerful families in the city. But there was a problem. The Parkers demanded an exorbitant dowry, and the Sullivans were drowning in debt from their failing business ventures. Their only way out was to ensure Sarah's marriage to Ethan went through at any cost. And that cost was me. What does this have to do with me? I asked, already dreading the answer. Margaret exhaled sharply. To protect Sarah's reputation, we've presented you as our eldest daughter. The Parkers must never suspect that we have an adopted child. If they found out, it could ruin everything. If Sarah is to be Ethan's wife, her image must remain untarnished. I stared at them in disbelief. So you're lying to the Parkers? Watch your tone, George snapped. You should be grateful. You'll have a husband, a home. A man I don't even know. I cut in. And what do I get in return? Sarah scoffed. You get to be useful for once. My hands clenched into fists. I had spent my whole life under their roof, trying to earn their love, their approval. But to them, I was never family. I was a pawn, a disposable asset. And now, they were selling me off like an unwanted possession. Nathan Reed, I repeated, my voice trembling. You're marrying me off to a poor man just so Sarah can marry a billionaire? He's not entirely destitute, Margaret said dismissively. He has a small business. It's a respectable match. A small business? That meant nothing. What I knew for sure was that he wasn't Ethan Parker. He wasn't the heir to an empire. And to the Sullivans. That made him worthless. What if I refuse? I asked, my heart pounding. George's expression darkened. Then you can pack your things and leave this house. I swallowed hard. I had nothing. No savings, no inheritance, nothing of my own. They had made sure of that. If I left, I would have nowhere to go. Margaret smirked, sensing my hesitation. I suggest you don't make things difficult. We've already announced the engagement. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them see me cry. Instead, I lifted my chin, keeping my voice steady. Fine. I'll marry him. Sarah clapped her hands together, feigning excitement. Oh, Emma, that's wonderful. I'm sure you'll be very happy with your husband. The mockery in her voice was unmistakable. But I had no choice. My fate had been sealed the moment they took me in. I was the unwanted daughter, and now I was being discarded. Little did they know, they had just set into motion a series of events that would change everything. Because Nathan Reed wasn't who they thought he was. And neither was I. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. The wedding dress I wore was nothing like the extravagant gown Sarah had tried on just weeks ago. Mine was simple, plain, something hastily bought, as if my wedding was an afterthought. The lace on the sleeves was slightly frayed, and the bodice felt tight, as if it had been altered for someone else. It wouldn't have surprised me if it was a discarded dress from Sarah's fitting sessions. The door burst open, and Sarah and Madison sauntered in, their faces twisted with glee. Oh, Emma, Sarah crooned, her voice sickly sweet. You actually look decent. I was expecting worse. Madison snickered. Well, with a groom like Nathan Reed, did you really need to try? I mean, he's basically a peasant, right? Maybe we should have gotten you a burlap sack instead of a dress. I clenched my fists, keeping my face neutral. I had learned long ago that reacting only gave them more satisfaction. You should be grateful, Sarah continued, circling me like a vulture. Without us, you'd be on the streets. Instead, you get a husband. Sure, he's poor, but at least you're not alone. Madison reached out and tugged at my veil. Ugh, this thing is hideous. Do you even deserve to wear white? With a hard yank, she nearly ripped it off my head, making my hair unravel from its careful styling. I bit the inside of my cheek, refusing to let them see me flinch. The sound of heels clicking against the floor made me turn to the doorway. My so-called mother, Margaret Sullivan, stood there, arms crossed, lips curled in disgust. "Why are you still standing there?" she snapped. "The ceremony is starting. You should be grateful we even arranged this for you. Don't make a scene." Her words were laced with venom, but her eyes held something even worse, apathy. I was nothing more than a burden being cast away. I took a deep breath and walked past them, refusing to acknowledge their whispers as they trailed behind me. The ceremony was humiliating. Instead of a grand wedding hall filled with flowers and chandeliers, I was led into a small, dimly lit venue. The decorations were minimal, the guest list practically non-existent. Sarah's wedding to Ethan Parker was scheduled to be the event of the year, a luxurious affair with elite guests and extravagant details. Mine, on the other hand, was reduced to something forgettable, intentional, no doubt. I stood at the altar, my hands trembling slightly. The guests, mainly distant relatives and a handful of my adoptive parents' business acquaintances, whispered among themselves, throwing glances filled with pity or scorn. Nathan stood before me, dressed in a simple yet well-fitted black suit. His posture was composed, his expression unreadable. Despite everything, he looked calm, almost indifferent, as if none of this affected him. "I give this girl to be married to this man," my adoptive father, Robert Sullivan, said in a monotone voice, barely looking at me. There was no warmth, no sentimentality. It was as if he were handing off a piece of property. I swallowed the lump in my throat. When the vows were exchanged, I could hear Madison giggling in the crowd. "She's actually marrying a nobody. This is too good." Nathan slid the ring onto my finger, his touch light but firm. When it was my turn, I hesitated for a moment before slipping the band onto his hand. His fingers brushed against mine, steady and warm. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced. A wave of whispers broke out. "Oh God, do they really have to?" someone murmured. Madison let out a dramatic gasp. "I might be sick." Sarah smirked from the front row, her arms crossed as she leaned over to whisper to Ethan, who chuckled lowly. Nathan leaned in slightly, and for a brief second, I thought he would actually go through with it. But instead, he barely brushed his lips against my forehead, his touch fleeting yet strangely protective. The crowd murmured again, some scoffing, others looking disappointed that they weren't given a spectacle to gossip about. Margaret clicked her tongue. "It's done. Let's leave already." As we walked down the aisle, I caught a glimpse of my adoptive parents. Neither of them looked proud or happy. If anything, they seemed relieved to be rid of me. The reception, if it could even be called that, was a small gathering with minimal food and a cheap-looking cake. The guests barely stayed long, offering half-hearted congratulations before leaving. The only ones who remained were Sarah, Madison, and a few of their friends, all eager to get in their final jabs. "Emma," Sarah called sweetly, approaching me with a flute of champagne in hand. "Are you going to take his last name? Or are you too embarrassed to be called Mrs. Reed?" I clenched my jaw. "It's none of your business." Madison laughed. "Oh, it totally is. We have to know what to call you when we see you shopping at the thrift store or working at a diner." The group erupted into laughter. Nathan, who had been silent for most of the evening, finally spoke up. "I'd be careful with your words," he said, his voice low but firm. "You never know when life might surprise you." Sarah scoffed. "Oh, please. Are you threatening me, Reed? What can you possibly do? You have nothing." Nathan merely smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "You'd be surprised." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Come on, Madison. Let's leave before we get infected by their mediocrity." As they left, I let out a shaky breath. The humiliation, the insults, the mockery. I had endured it all. But as I turned to Nathan, I saw something in his gaze that made me pause. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. If anything, he looked amused. And for the first time that night, I had a strange feeling. Maybe Nathan Reed wasn't as simple as he seemed. I used to think Sarah had one. She was the golden child, the one who got everything she ever wanted. While I was thrown away like trash, she was draped in the finest silk, paraded around like a prized jewel, and married off to the most powerful family in the city, the Parkers. On the day of her wedding, the entire city watched as she walked down the aisle in an extravagant designer gown, a diamond tiara glistening on her head. Sarah's lips curled into a triumphant smirk, eyes full of condescension as she passed by, not sparing me a single glance. But reality has a cruel way of humbling the arrogant. Sarah had barely settled into her new life when the illusion started to crack. Ethan Parker, the dashing wealthy heir who had been the subject of countless fantasies, turned out to be anything but a fairy tale prince. In public, he was charming, sophisticated, a perfect gentleman. But behind closed doors, he was a monster. The first time he raised his hand against Sarah was just 3 days after their wedding. Sarah had merely spoken out of turn, questioning why he came home late without informing her. The slap came without warning. Sharp, brutal, leaving a red imprint across her cheek. Her head snapped to the side, her body trembling as she stared at him in disbelief. "You will speak when spoken to," Ethan hissed, towering over her. "You're my wife now. Your job is to obey." Sarah had never been disciplined in her life. She had been pampered, adored, and spoiled to the point where she believed the world revolved around her. But in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She was no longer in control. Ethan's family, the Parkers, were no better. They never wanted Sarah for who she was. They wanted a pawn, a woman they could use to solidify their business empire. Her mother-in-law, Victoria Parker, treated her like a servant. The woman had always been cold, but now that Sarah was officially part of their family, she was relentless in her cruelty. "Fix my dress, you incompetent girl. This coffee is too cold. Are you useless?" Ethan could have married someone more valuable, but here we are. Day after day, they stripped Sarah of her dignity. She had always looked down on me, mocked my so-called lowly status, but now, she was the one being degraded. The high society luncheons she once loved became nightmares. The wealthy women she used to gossip with now whispered about her behind her back. She had married into power, but she had lost her own. Then came the final blow. One evening, Sarah overheard Ethan talking to his father in the study. "We got what we needed," Ethan said coldly. "Her family's connections and whatever scraps they had left of their business. She's useless to me now." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Then why keep her?" his father asked. Ethan scoffed. "For now, she's still a Parker by name. But if she steps out of line, we'll make sure she disappears." Quietly, terror gripped her chest. She wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was nothing more than a transaction. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood what it felt like to be powerless. Meanwhile, the Sullivans, her beloved parents, were falling apart. The debts they had been trying to hide were suffocating them. They had gambled everything on Ethan's support, but the Parkers had no intention of saving them. They had squeezed every bit of value from Sarah's marriage and discarded them like garbage. Mr. Sullivan grew desperate, his proud posture hunched under the weight of impending bankruptcy. Mrs. Sullivan, once elegant and graceful, now looked perpetually stressed, her hair beginning to gray at the roots. One day, Sarah called her mother, her voice frantic. "Mother, you have to help me. Ethan, he's not who we thought he was. I don't think I'm safe here." But Mrs. Sullivan's voice was devoid of warmth. "You have to endure, Sarah," she said flatly. "For the family." Sarah choked on a sob. "You don't understand. He's hurting me." A long silence stretched between them before Mrs. Sullivan finally spoke. "We have no money left, Sarah. No power. If you leave that marriage, you'll have nothing. Do you understand?" "Nothing." Sarah's hands trembled. She had always believed her parents would protect her, but in that moment, she realized the awful truth. They had only ever protected themselves. She had thrown me to the wolves, thinking she was securing her own happiness. But fate had a cruel sense of irony. She was the one trapped in a cage, and no one was coming to save her. Meanwhile, the sister they discarded, was thriving, but they didn't know that yet. Sarah believed I was living in poverty, suffering in my miserable marriage to Nathan. She had no idea what was coming next. And I never imagined it would come to this. The life I now lead, so far removed from the role they forced me into, the life that's built on secrets, lies, and the mask I wear every day. But that's the reality I've had to accept. The Emma they created, the obedient, forgotten, humiliated adopted daughter, is not the real me. Behind closed doors, I'm someone else. Someone important. It feels strange to say out loud, but I am a world-renowned doctor. Not just any doctor, an expert in medical research, specializing in the treatment of diseases that no one has been able to cure. In the world of science, my name holds weight, even if no one knows who I really am. I work under an alias, Dr. Evelyn Adams, and I've spent years building this hidden life. My research team, spread across various countries, is my only true family now. They rely on me, trust me, and look to me for guidance. They don't know my past, and they never will. It's my secret, the one thing that I protect more fiercely than anything else. The Sullivans have never understood who I really am, and I plan to keep it that way. The world sees me as nothing more than the neglected adopted daughter, but under the guise of Evelyn Adams, I am someone they all look to. My team respects me. The patients whose lives I save are eternally grateful, and yet no one knows the real face behind it all. It's the only way I could have done it. When I married Nathan, I didn't tell him any of this. He had no idea that I had this double life, and honestly, I didn't want to tell him. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted to keep him safe. I was still haunted by the past, by the Sullivans, by Sarah, by the cruelty they had forced me to endure. I didn't want him dragged into it. But lately, Nathan has started noticing. I can tell he's beginning to question my disappearances, the late nights when I sneak out of our tiny apartment to meet with my team in secret locations, the sudden urgency when I get a call that demands my attention. The questions are there in his eyes, the concern in his voice, though he hasn't pushed too hard yet. Nathan, I'm fine, I always say, brushing it off with a quick excuse. Just some late meetings, you know how it is. But deep down, I can see him watching me with growing curiosity. He's not the type to pry, not unless he feels something is off, and I can feel the tension building between us. Nathan Reed, my husband, has always been gentle, kind, and understanding, yet his patience is wearing thin. I'm not the woman he thinks I am, but in some ways, I'm beginning to fear that I might be the woman he never wanted me to be. The first time he confronted me about it was one evening, after a long day of work. I had slipped away, leaving behind a hurried note, and returned in the early morning hours. Nathan didn't say anything that night, but the next evening, he was different. His usual warmth was gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate air of concern. Emma, he began, his voice calm but firm. Where do you go every night? You leave so suddenly, without a word. I know it's more than just work. There's something you're not telling me, and I need to know. I froze in place, caught in the act of removing my coat, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. What could I tell him? What should I tell him? Nothing, Nathan. Really, it's nothing, I replied, offering him a nervous smile. You're overthinking it. But his eyes, those eyes, never stopped searching mine, like he could see right through the facade I'd built. It's one of the things I love and hate about him at the same time. Nathan's not a fool. You're lying, he said quietly, almost to himself. I don't know why you're doing this, but I know it's not just work. It's more than that. You're hiding something, and it's tearing us apart. I could feel the walls closing in. I knew I had to answer him, but how could I? I couldn't let him in on the truth, not yet. He was already worried enough, and telling him about my research would only add more pressure to our already fragile marriage. I'm not hiding anything, I finally said, though my words felt hollow. I'm just tired. It's nothing more than that. I promise. Nathan didn't seem convinced, but he let the conversation go for the time being. But I knew it wouldn't last. He'd keep digging, and I wouldn't be able to keep this secret from him forever. Still, it was easier to tell him nothing than to expose myself to him. My life was complicated enough already. The last thing I needed was for Nathan to find out the truth about my work, about who I truly am. He deserves a simple life, a life far removed from the chaos of my past, far away from the mess the Sullivans created. I had to protect him, even if it meant lying to him. But there's one thing that's become undeniable. The longer I keep this secret, the harder it becomes to live with. The more I lie to Nathan, the more I see the hurt in his eyes. I can't keep doing this to him. Sooner or later, I'll have to come clean. But for now, I can only hope that he never digs deep enough to find the truth. I watch him carefully, trying to keep my feelings hidden behind the mask I've built for myself, but I feel the cracks forming. Soon the truth will break through. I just hope Nathan can forgive me when it does. The day the Sullivans' empire began to crumble, I watched it all unfold from the shadows, pretending I didn't care, but inside, I was torn between satisfaction and pity. The world I had once been a part of, a world of lavish parties, designer gowns, and endless wealth, was crashing down, piece by piece. I knew it was coming, of course. The reckless spending, the loans, the desperate bids for status and influence, it was all too obvious. But still, seeing it happen was something entirely different. The Sullivans were drowning in debt. A mountain of loans they had taken out, thinking they could leverage Ethan's family's wealth to bail them out, had become a suffocating weight on their shoulders. For months, the phone calls, the meetings, and the tense conversations behind closed doors had been brewing, and now it was finally happening. It wasn't just that the money was gone. It was the way they handled it, desperation clawing at their every move. They had lost everything, and they didn't know where to turn. They had relied so heavily on Ethan's family for support, but Ethan refused to help them. The same man who had once been so eager to claim the Sullivan name, who had married Sarah for status and wealth, now stood coldly indifferent as his in-laws floundered. Ethan's refusal to help was no surprise to me. It was, in fact, the only consistent thing about him. But what happened next that I wasn't prepared for? I was sitting in my quiet, peaceful home with Nathan, feeling a strange sense of relief after the tumultuous few days of revelations when my phone rang. The caller ID read, Sullivan Residence. My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. My adopted parents never called unless they needed something, usually money. But I never expected them to stoop so low. I answered, and immediately, my mother's voice, sharp, calculating, and dripping with false concern, pierced through the line. Emma, she started, her tone sweet but brittle. We need to talk. Your father and I are in a very difficult situation. You've heard about the financial troubles, haven't you? We're on the verge of losing everything. I could hear the faintest crack in her voice, but I wasn't fooled. There was no sorrow in her words, only a well-practiced plea for help. It was as if they had been rehearsing this conversation, preparing for the moment they would need to lean on me. I wanted to hang up. I didn't owe them anything. I've heard, I replied coldly, trying to keep my voice neutral. But I'm not in a position to help. Emma, darling, she cooed, you don't understand. We're talking about your future here. If you don't help us, everything will be lost. You'll lose your inheritance, your legacy. And Nathan, well, Nathan's business is so small, isn't it? You could easily help us out. We know you've made some good money for yourself. A small contribution from you could go a long way. It took everything in me not to laugh. My mother's words, so manipulative and entitled, were all too familiar. She was trying to guilt me, using every trick in her book to make me feel responsible for their failure. The problem was, I wasn't the naive young girl she once controlled. I wasn't going to fall for it. I don't have the kind of money you're asking for, I said, my voice steady. And Nathan's business is his own. You can't rely on me for your mistakes. You'll have to find another way out. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. I could almost hear her scrambling for the right words. Emma, don't be foolish. You have what it takes to fix this. You always have. You're not a child anymore. You have the power to make this right. Her words twisted in my chest. Power. It was all about power. They thought they could manipulate me into handing over what little I had worked so hard to build. But I wasn't the naive girl they could control anymore. I had fought for my independence. They had no right to it. I hung up without another word. the weight of the conversation settling heavily on my shoulders. But that was only the beginning. That evening, Nathan and I were having dinner when there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find one of the Sullivan family's attorneys, a slick, polished man whose name I could never quite remember. He stood there, a nervous smile on his face, holding a large envelope. "Mrs. Reed, I'm here to discuss some matters with you and your husband," he said. His eyes flickered to Nathan as he handed me the envelope. I glanced at Nathan, who raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice low, the edge of curiosity creeping in. The attorney cleared his throat. "It's regarding the debts. The Sullivans are in dire straits, and they've made an offer. They'd like to discuss a deal, one that could alleviate some of their burdens. But they require your assistance." His eyes flickered nervously as he added, "They believe Nathan's business might be the solution." I looked at the envelope in my hands, the weight of it making my stomach churn. Nathan's business was small, sure, but it wasn't just small, it was thriving. The last thing I wanted was for the Sullivans to see it as their golden ticket. They had already humiliated me enough. "Absolutely not," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tension. "Nathan doesn't owe them anything." The attorney seemed taken aback, clearly expecting a different response. He opened his mouth to protest, but I interrupted. "They're trying to use him, just like they've always used me. Nathan doesn't owe them a single dime." The attorney's expression hardened slightly, as though he was getting the picture. "Very well," he said. "But be aware that if this isn't resolved soon, there could be serious repercussions for all involved. The Sullivans will not be pleased." With that, he turned and left, but the air between Nathan and me was thick with unspoken tension. "You're sure about this?" Nathan asked quietly. "Absolutely," I said. "They've already tried to use me once. I won't let them use you too." But what neither Nathan nor I knew was that this was far from over. The Sullivans were desperate, and when desperate people are backed into a corner, they do things you would never expect. What came next would shake us both to our core. The next day, I received a call from Sarah. Her voice was almost unrecognizable, frantic, desperate, a far cry from the smug arrogance I had always associated with her. "Emma," she gasped, "I don't know who else to turn to. We're drowning. Ethan's family won't help us. I thought I had everything figured out, but now I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I don't want to lose everything." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the way she had treated me, how she had thrown me into this life of ridicule and mockery. She wasn't crying for help. She was crying because her world was falling apart, and she realized that her golden ticket, the one she thought would secure her future, was slipping away. "You should have thought about that before, Sarah," I said, my voice cold and distant. "You're on your own now." And with that, I hung up. What I didn't know was that the Sullivans would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. I wasn't expecting the call. It was a lazy Tuesday afternoon, and I was wrapped up in the comfortable rhythm of my day when my phone buzzed. Sarah Sullivan's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for a moment. We'd never been close, and our interactions were often strained, to say the least. She only ever called when she needed something, and I was starting to get used to that fact. I hesitated, then swiped the screen to answer. "Hello." "Emma," Sarah's voice came through, and there was an edge to it that I couldn't ignore. "We need to talk. It's about Nathan." I didn't like the sound of that. Nathan and I had always kept a low profile, and I couldn't imagine what Sarah could possibly want with him. "What about Nathan?" "I need you to listen carefully," Sarah said, her tone serious. "It's about his company. You don't know the full story. He's not who you think he is." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "There's something you don't know, Emma," Sarah continued, her voice laced with something that sounded like a mixture of surprise and frustration. "Nathan is the CEO of Reed's investment company. He's a billionaire. A real billionaire." I blinked, stunned. "Nathan? My husband, Nathan? The man I married? The one who always downplayed his achievements and kept his life so private? A billionaire CEO? That wasn't possible." Nathan had always been modest to the point of hiding his true potential. This was something I never could have imagined. Wait, what?" "Nathan is the CEO of Reed's." I could barely get the words out, still trying to wrap my mind around what Sarah was saying. Yes, she replied, sounding exasperated. And we had no idea. We went to his office today, expecting some small business, and instead, we found this massive, luxurious corporate space. It's like a skyscraper there. The CEO's office? It's huge, Emma. The view? It's the best I've ever seen. And then Nathan, he's sitting there behind this giant desk. He's been hiding it from us, from you, from everyone. I was stunned, and there was an unsettling silence on my end of the line. I couldn't speak for a moment, still trying to process the idea that Nathan, the quiet, humble man I knew, had somehow built an empire without ever saying a word about it. But how did you find out? I finally managed to ask. You just walked into his office and found out who he really was? Sarah sighed, sounding like she was trying to compose herself. It wasn't exactly like that. We went there looking for help, you know? Ethan's business is in trouble, and we thought Nathan could pull us out of it. But when we got there, we were in shock. We thought it was some kind of mistake. The whole office looked like it belonged to someone powerful. We should have known. But no one, not one person, ever told us the truth about Nathan. So you just walked into his office, and there he was, the CEO? I repeated, still not quite believing it. Exactly. And when we realized who he was, everything changed. Nathan wasn't this nobody we thought he was. He wasn't some small-time businessman. He was a CEO, and a billionaire at that. The irony is, he didn't say anything. He just looked at us coldly, like we should have known all along. He didn't offer any help. He just let us sit there and stew in our own ignorance. A chuckle bubbled up from within me, and I quickly suppressed it. The idea of Sarah and Ethan, so used to treating Nathan like a pawn, now realizing they had been playing the wrong game, was just too rich. And did you ask him for help? I asked, trying to mask my amusement. Of course we did, Sarah said, almost defensively. But he refused. Refused, Emma. After everything we've done for him, after everything we thought he owed us. Oh, I bet that went over well, I muttered, half sarcastic. We needed his help, Sarah continued, her voice tight with frustration. Ethan's investments are crumbling. We thought he could save us. He's supposed to be the one who can help. Sarah's voice rose a little, as if she were frustrated that I couldn't understand the gravity of the situation. And when we asked, Nathan just... She trailed off, then spat. He mocked us. Mocked us. Told us that we forced you into a marriage with a nobody, and that we never even bothered to check who he really was. My heart skipped a beat at the thought of Nathan standing up to them like that. I had never seen him get so cold or distant with anyone, least of all the Sullivans. They had always treated him like a stepping stone, a tool they could use to get ahead, but never once had they considered that he might be the one in control. What did you do after he refused? I asked, now genuinely curious. We left, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. We couldn't believe it. I mean, we didn't want to believe it. But now we're out of options. We've lost everything. Ethan's business is falling apart. We thought we had it all, but now we've lost everything. I knew it would be bad, but hearing her words made everything feel so final. Sarah and Ethan had always been so sure of themselves, so arrogant about their ability to handle everything, but now the tables had turned. They had nothing left but their pride, and even that was about to crumble. Later that day, my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Sarah. It was my parents. Emma, darling, my adopted mother's voice came through, sounding unusually somber. We have news. We found out who Nathan really is. Yes. My adopted father's voice joined in, sounding almost as shocked as I had felt. We didn't know the full extent of it until we visited his office ourselves. He's not just any businessman, Emma. He's the CEO of Reed's investment company. We walked into his office, and it was like walking into a palace. The view, the luxury, the power he commands. It was like we were in the presence of someone untouchable. My heart skipped. CEO, pretending I was hearing it for the first time. I couldn't help but laugh a little, feeling a rush of both amusement and disbelief. My adopted parents, too? It seemed like everyone was coming to the same shocking realization. So now what? I asked, still trying to process the absurdity of it all. "We want to know what he's going to do," George said, almost pleading. "You have to talk to him, Emma. You're his wife. Maybe he'll help us." "Help you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Help you with what, exactly? After everything, you still think he'll help you?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could feel the weight of their guilt. They had never treated me or Nathan with the respect we deserved either. Now, they were learning that there were consequences for their actions. It was later that evening, after all the calls and after I'd had time to process the shock of the day, that Nathan came home. His usual quiet self, he walked through the door with a faint smile on his face, but there was something in his eyes that made me realize just how much he had been holding back. The night was quiet, the air cool as it brushed through the open windows of our bedroom. I sat at the edge of the bed, the soft light of the moon spilling through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Nathan had just returned from another of his meetings, though this one had been different. There was something about him tonight, something in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at me, as if he were waiting for something, or maybe confessing something. I hadn't asked him about it, though. I knew better than to push Nathan when he was in one of those moods. But tonight felt different. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and I knew the moment he walked through the door that he had something to say. Something important. He walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood in front of me, his eyes holding mine with an intensity one hadn't seen before. He exhaled deeply, almost as if steeling himself for whatever he was about to say. "Emma," he began, his voice low, carrying a weight I could feel. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I frowned, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's going on, Nathan? What's all this about?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, before sitting down beside me. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, his gaze drifted to the floor, and I could tell he was grappling with something heavy in his mind. The silence stretched for a few long moments, and I could feel my heart beating faster in anticipation of what was to come. "I've been keeping something from you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something important. And it's time you knew the truth." I shifted slightly, leaning closer to him. "What truth?" Nathan's hand reached for mine, his fingers brushing against mine with a tenderness that sent a chill down my spine. "I didn't just marry you because of my feelings for you, Emma. I didn't marry you because I wanted a life with you. I married you because it was part of a bigger plan. A plan I had in motion long before we ever met." My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. I could feel my pulse quicken, the words sinking in slowly. "What do you mean? A plan?" He looked at me then, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce determination. "I'm not just Nathan Reed, Emma. I'm the Nathan Reed, the CEO of Reed's investment company. The man you've been married to is the head of a global empire, one that stretches across industries and continents. I built it all myself from the ground up. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want you to know." I could feel my breath catch in my throat. "You're the CEO of Reed's?" I repeated, the words almost foreign on my tongue. It didn't make sense. Nathan, the man who had always been so humble, so quiet about his accomplishments, was the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world? "I didn't want anyone to treat me differently," he continued, his voice strained, as if the weight of his words was finally getting to him. "I didn't want you to marry me because of who I am, but because of who I am to you. But the truth is, I couldn't keep hiding it. Not from you. You deserve the truth." My mind was reeling. The man I thought I knew, the man I married, was someone entirely different than what I had imagined. And yet, deep down, I felt a sense of relief. Nathan wasn't hiding anything from me out of malice. He wasn't trying to deceive me. He was protecting me. But now, everything was coming to light. I stared at him for a long moment, taking in the depth of his words. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't angry. If anything, I was more intrigued. I knew Nathan had always been secretive, but this was beyond anything I could have expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally asked, my voice soft but steady. "Why keep it a secret for so long?" He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want you to think I was using you for my own gain. I didn't want you to feel like you were just a pawn in some business deal. When I married you, it was because I loved you, Emma. But I knew the moment you found out about my true identity, everything would change. I didn't want to risk it. I wanted us to be us without any outside influences. I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have. I blinked, his words stirring something deep inside me. It was crazy. Everything he was saying was insane, but in a way, it made sense. Nathan had never been a man to flaunt his wealth or status. He kept his personal life separate from his professional one, and I had admired him for that. He wasn't like the others. And now I saw why. Before I could respond, Nathan's eyes softened, and his voice dropped even lower. But there's more, Emma. I'm telling you all of this because I need you to know the truth. Because I trust you. And because there's something I should have told you long before now. I felt a knot form in my stomach, fear bubbling to the surface. What is it? I whispered, barely able to contain my curiosity. He took a deep breath, looking at me with a mixture of vulnerability and sincerity. I didn't just marry you for business, Emma. I married you because I wanted to. Because I knew, deep down, that you were the one. And the truth is, I've loved you from the moment I met you. You were never a business deal, never a strategy. You were always my choice. You've always been my choice. The words hung in the air between us, and I could feel the walls I had built up around my heart starting to crumble. The intensity in his eyes was too much for me to ignore. I had always known Nathan was special, but now I saw just how deeply he cared for me. I was still absorbing everything when a small smirk tugged at the corners of my lips. Well, I said, my voice playful, I guess we both had our secrets. Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. What do you mean? I leaned in slightly, my gaze never leaving his. I guess it's time I told you mine, I said, my smile growing. I'm the world's most sought-after doctor. His eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might be speechless. But then he let out a soft laugh. I should have known, he said, shaking his head in amusement. You always were full of surprises. We both laughed then, the tension breaking between us as we shared a quiet moment of understanding. In that instant, everything felt right. We had both been hiding pieces of ourselves from one another. But now, in the light of this shared revelation, I felt closer to him than ever before. Our love wasn't built on secrets or lies. It was built on something much stronger, trust, understanding, and an unspoken connection that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The days that followed were nothing short of magical. Nathan and I grew even closer, our bond deepening with each passing hour. We spent our time together, reveling in the comfort of knowing that we could finally be ourselves without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. But while we basked in the warmth of our newfound honesty, the world around us was crumbling for the Sullivans. Sarah, once so sure of herself, found her world unraveling at an alarming rate. Her marriage to Ethan fell apart when she discovered he had lost everything: his investments, his reputation, and his pride. The construction project he had poured so much money into was ordered by the government to be demolished, and it all came crashing down. The once powerful Sullivans were now penniless, humiliated, and abandoned by everyone who once stood by them. Madison, still clinging to whatever remnants of influence she could grasp, tried to suck up to me in an attempt to regain some favor. But I wasn't interested in playing her game anymore. I walked past her without a word, knowing full well that she would never have the respect she once thought she deserved. As for Sarah, she found herself isolated, her family torn apart by greed and ambition. She was left with nothing but regret, and perhaps the bitter knowledge that she had lost everything by underestimating me. 3 years passed, and everything had changed. Nathan and I had built a life that was both extraordinary and ordinary in its own way. We had a son, Lucas Reed, a little boy who was the light of our lives. He was adored by both of us, and his laughter filled our home with warmth. He was the perfect combination of Nathan's quiet strength and my unwavering determination, and I couldn't help but feel that everything had come full circle. Nathan and I had found our place in the world. I ran a successful medical institute, helping to shape the future of healthcare, while Nathan continued to dominate the business world with Reed's investment company. We were wealthy, respected, and deeply in love. But more than that, we were partners in every sense of the word. Together, we were unstoppable. And as for the Sullivans, they watched from afar, realizing that the girl they had once thrown away, the girl they thought was nothing, had become someone untouchable. Someone they could never reach. Someone who had built her own empire, with the man she loved by her side. I couldn't help but smile as I watched them from a distance. They had thought they could break me, but in the end, I had become something they could never understand. I had become everything I was always meant to be. And I had Nathan by my side, my partner in all things, as we faced the future together. And I wouldn't have it any other way.